Thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many of you during this uncertain time. Look forward to engaging with you today, talking about student engagement. Just a couple quick kickoff notes here. You can get to the session materials through this link here. We've got our PowerPoint up there, and we have some example Google Sheets. If you'd like to follow along during the presentation, make a copy of these sheets and add it to your own drive or move it to your own folders. I would prefer that don't mess too much with the presentation materials because I will need those in a second. I also think it's totally appropriate to just watch the presentation, follow along, and then you can go grab those materials later if you want to use any of the techniques that we outline. So got the chat running through the app, so feel free to ask your questions in there. We'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation, and we'll just kind of hop in if anybody has any questions. So I am Dan Wick, and we have Laura Lund here as well. We are from EdOps. I've been at EdOps for a couple years now. I work with our DC and New York schools and also do a lot of our product design efforts, which we're going to take a look at some of the work we've been doing with Google Sheets later on today. I'll hand it over to Laura.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm Laura Lund. I am the regional manager for the EdOps DC data team. And if you're not familiar with EdOps or the work that we do, go ahead, Dan. I'll tell you a little bit more about us right now. So EdOps helps schools achieve operational excellence. So right now our data team serves 37 schools across 6 states, and we support about 14,000 students. The way we normally support schools falls into a couple of different categories and buckets. We help school leaders answer questions. We get questions all day long, helping schools pull out actionable insights from their data with our student data analytics service. We also make sure that those insights are based off of super squeaky clean and well-organized data as we help schools manage their data in their student information system and keep it connected to third-party platforms too. We also are here to help schools make sure that they're complying with any local, federal, or state compliance requests, whether that be related to their audit or not. That's normally how we support schools. But our work, like many folks, I'm sure, changed quite a lot once the COVID-19 pandemic hit and schools shut down in March for the public health emergency. We still got questions from schools, but the kinds of questions we got changed quite a bit. We heard from school leaders things like, I need to revamp the way that we're tracking our call log. How should we do that? Or I need to know if kids are logging into this blended learning platform on a daily basis. What's the fastest and easiest way to do that? Or how would this change in our grading policy affect GPAs? So we were used to getting questions about, well, can you help me understand how my kids are learning? But it was a little bit new to us to answer questions about how are our students engaged. So from this presentation, we wanted to pull together a lot of the lessons learned we have from the last few months and speak to you about something that's been on our mind quite a lot as we move into the new school year. And that's specifically how we're measuring student attendance and student engagement and what the difference is between those two values. So we'll talk about that today. We are also going to share with you some best practices that we've gathered around collecting what we're calling hand-entered or basically not automated data. So this is information you're gathering from students, parents, or teachers in either a spreadsheet or a form. I would imagine that all of us have a tracker sitting somewhere in our bookmarks, at least one. So we're going to talk about best practices to set those up so that you can do the analysis you would like to do at the end of the day. We are also going to walk through some use cases for some of the Google Sheet functions that we use on a day-to-day basis. These help us iterate quickly through dashboard design and also allow our end products to be more self-service, which is not only faster for us, but it allows our end users to get data in the time frame that they want it, not always on our schedule, which we greatly enjoy. And finally, we'll show you an example of a dashboard that combines a lot of these things together and walk you through our thought process as we went about designing that. the questions that we ask ourselves as we go through the data collection defining process and as we build our dashboards. So that's the objective for today. If you have any questions, I'll once again point you to the Whova chat, and we will be monitoring that. Feel free to put those in there as they come up. So those are our objectives. Let's go ahead and jump in to our first slide. There we go. So first things first, what is attendance and what is engagement? Did quite a bit of research in preparing for this presentation, and go figure, there's a lot of definitions for both of these things depending on what perspective you're taking. But at the most basic level, if you boil it all the way down to its very core, the way that we think about attendance in education and have for the last several decades is attendance is either you are present or you are absent. You physically showed up today or you did not. It is binary, and those are your only two options. Whereas engagement, which has a lot of definitions as well, if you boil it all the way down to its core, it requires some kind of active participation from the student. They have to be involved somehow or doing something to be engaged in the educational services they receive that day. It's not enough just to show up, you have to also act. So attendance and engagement should be a step above, or has a slightly higher threshold for you to reach that level. Go on, thank you. So let's look at how the definitions for attendance and engagement are changing for the upcoming year. And the good news is we have guidance from our friends at OSSI about what attendance should look like for school year 2021. So their policy dictates that schools are going to take attendance for both in-person and virtual or distance learning. Whether that is synchronous or asynchronous, schools are responsible for recording that on a daily basis. If schools are offering in-person services, then it is business as usual. Schools should just follow the procedures they've had in place for years to count that. For distance learning, we have a couple of different options here. The first depends on whether or not the LEA has chosen to use a learning management system or an LMS to help facilitate tracking attendance. An LMS would be, the way an LMS would track attendance would be they would log into the system and then the student would be noted as being here by virtue of logging in. If the school isn't using an LMS, then OSSI asks that they have one-on-one contact with an adult in the building, and that would constitute that check to say that I'm here. But if we look closer at the definition for attendance in distance learning, there's actually two requirements. The first is LMS authentication or one-on-one contact, but the second is actually the word engagement, which is interesting. And I think that begs the question then, well, what is engagement and how do we measure it? And in our research, we found that there's actually several ways that researchers, several lenses through which researchers say you can measure engagement. The first would be behavioral, and the options that you see here are probably going to be the actions that students take that account for that second half of the attendance definition for distance learning this year. These are things like logging into an online platform or attending a virtual lesson, watching a video, completing an assignment or submitting an assignment, doing something to indicate that you are actively participating in your schooling that day. That's our first category. But it's not the only category through which we can view engagement. The second is through a cognitive perspective. So how are students engaging on an intellectual level with their material for that day? It may not be enough for a student to necessarily just complete an assignment, but what happens if we look at the grade that they earn of that assignment? Or if we can tell that they're demonstrating mastery or growth on a certain set of standards based off of the work they've completed. You can also look at the way students are participating in online lessons, like what their conversations look like with their peers, the feedback that they're giving or receiving, the kinds of questions they're asking. That can give us some insight into how students are engaging cognitively on a day-to-day basis. And the final lens through which we can view engagement is through an emotional perspective or socio-emotional perspective. How are students connected to our school community? Do they feel satisfied with our community? Do they feel like they have the opportunity to engage with their peers? Are they making a connection with someone, with one of their teachers or an adult in the building? That is the last kind of lens through which we can view engagement. So even with all of these lenses, that still doesn't get us all the way down to the nitty-gritty of, and here's what engagement means for my school. And I will just call out a name, that we did not provide a formula on this screen to say, for this type of school with this type of program and this type of students, this is what engagement is. We thought about it a lot, and we have an example to show you in a bit, but the reason we didn't provide a formula is because it depends on so many different factors specific to your LEA and your program. Things like your student's age, the number of courses that they're taking in a day, which classes those are, how many staff members you have available to assist them and monitor them, the technology students have at home, and also the functionality of their systems and platforms too. So these are important factors to consider when determining kind of what the threshold for engagement is at your LEA. And I wanted to make one note about one of them, and that's this functionality of systems and platforms. And just like a small caution to throw out at this point, because it's something that I've seen in our work, and honestly something I'm guilty of myself as well. When faced with the need to analyze or collect a new type of data, it is often my first inclination to go with, well, what platform are we using? What's the system? What automatically generates that? And what can it do? And that'll define what my definition is for X, Y, or Z. Go ahead and click one more time, Dan. But instead, we want to caution everyone against, not just in this example, but anytime you're going out to create a tracking method or a report or a dashboard, instead of starting with the tool, make sure you're starting with the question you want answered, and then see what pieces of the tool can support the answer of that question and not the other way around. And I say this because I'm guilty of it as well. I love my relational databases. I wish everything could live in a nice, easy set of tables that only I can control and can never, be modified by anyone else. However, it's really important to make sure that at the end of the day, we get the answers we want that reflects the reality of our schools. So start with the question. Now, that being said, this question, like what is an engaged student, is still really big. So our recommendation is to break that down further. And we've chosen to break it down into those categories that we already talked about. So what is the threshold to determine if a student is present or absent? What behaviors would they need to demonstrate for us to know that you are present for the day? But if we went one step beyond that, how would we know if students are engaging in all of the different facets of our distance learning program? What would need to be true for us to be able to see that? We could take it a step further and say, how would we know if students are cognitively engaged in in distance learning? How would we know if they're demonstrating growth or mastery? And you can take it one step further and say, well, how would we know if students are emotionally connected to our school? Are they feeling invested in their education, invested in our community? So our guidance when you begin any kind of data collection process is to begin with the questions that you're trying to answer. Those are the questions I've outlined for this particular ask. Your LEA may choose to answer one or two first, or your questions may be framed slightly differently. That's okay too. But when you embark on this journey to set out a tracking system for engagement, start with your question first. The next thing we recommend is to make sure you're getting really clear on who your stakeholders are. So your stakeholders aren't only the people that are reviewing the data, using the report, and making decisions. Your stakeholders are also the people who are collecting the data and entering it into the system that you're designing to. So make sure you're clear on who's going to be using the information on either end, and think about them through the design process as well. also important to understand how often you're going to be looking at this data and how frequently you'll be changing your behaviors based off of that analysis. If it's something that you're going to be looking at every day, like attendance, then it probably makes sense for you to do something that is very simplistic, as automated as possible, and easy, since it's going to be something that you do every day. But if it's an analysis that's part of a day-to-day that maybe only happens every 6 to 8 weeks, perhaps it could be something that takes a little bit more time and is more qualitative, since you have more of a chance to examine that information. And then finally, after you've identified the answers to those 3 questions, finally, we look for the tool that's going to enable us to collect and then analyze the information for the above question. So speaking of tools, there are lots of options of tools that you can use to track student engagement. This first line is, I think, what we're calling automated systems, right? So it's information that lives in a web-based portal, probably, that's tied to a student ID, probably. Things like an LMS or a blended learning system or your SIS. You could also gather information through one or more than one tracker, right? We all love a tracker. We all have lots of uses for trackers. Or you could be collecting information from parents or students or teachers through a survey, like a Google form or a SurveyMonkey. All 3 are options. We've laid out a table of best practices to keep in mind while you're implementing systems in one of those tools. I'm not going to read this to you right now because a lot of this information will come back up when Dan takes over here in a second. But we wanted to put it in one place for you to see as a handy dandy reference here. All right, so I just mentioned that we're going to be hearing from Dan in a second, and he's going to be showing us what this looks like in practice. But to set the stage, come with me as we begin. I'll take a step back and imagine that we are all data managers, all 35 of us are data managers at an LEA that has tasked us with creating an engagement tracking system for the upcoming year. They have a gigantic budget, it's crazy, they have that much data support, it's wonderful. So we, along with our stakeholders, our principal, our executive director, et cetera, we've answered the questions we laid out a few slides ago. And these are our answers. We've identified the stakeholders, the timelines, and the tools we're going to use. So I'm going to walk through each of those, and then we'll see where a connection point is with Dan in a second. So under attendance, this school has decided that students will do 2 things to be counted as present. They will log into an LMS, and they will show their face on a Zoom classroom call at a designated time. Teachers using those 2 information will mark students as present in their SIS, and then attendance will be checked twice a day by the attendance coordinator, just like it was when school was in session. So our timeline is daily. Our stakeholders are going to be both the teachers and the attendance coordinator, and our tool is going to be our LMS, Zoom, and our SIS, our tools involved. To go one step beyond, to make sure we're capturing whether or not students are engaged in all facets of a distance learning, not just those that count for attendance, this school is requiring students to submit 2 exit tickets at the end of each day, and then all of the other assignments by the end of the week, which includes a reading log. We'll see that in a second. Teachers are going to be reviewing those submissions, entering information into their gradebook, and then reviewing how complete the gradebook is the following Monday, and use that information when they're making phone calls home on a weekly basis to families. So our timeline is weekly. Our tools involved would be our LMS and our gradebook and our SIS. And our stakeholders are just our teachers at this point. To make sure students are engaged cognitively, the school has decided that students will be graded on the assignments they submit, and teachers will review the notes that students are submitting in their reading log. Teachers, along with the instructional coaches, are going to review that data in their bi-weekly planning sessions as they plan lessons for the upcoming weeks. So our timeline here is bi-weekly. Our stakeholders are teachers and coaches, and we're using the information found in our gradebook and our reading log to make corrections or make adjustments. And then finally, to capture how emotionally engaged students are with our school community, the school decided that teachers are going to ask 1 to 2 questions of students as they make their weekly phone calls. Students' responses will then be recorded in a call log. I want to note that any immediate concerns would be flagged for the SST team, but other than that, they're going to be reviewing students' perceptions of their connection with the school community on a longer term, on a monthly basis instead. So here our timeline is monthly. Our stakeholders are the teachers and the student support team, the SST team, and the tool that we're using would be our call log. So that's the stage set. That's the landscape that we're going to be looking at here in a second. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan.
Right, so we have a question here. Can you speak to how we would use cognitive or social emotional definitions for engagement on a daily basis for OSSE's guidance?
Yeah, great question. I think you would need to set that up. It's in a similar way to if a student completed an assignment. If one of the criteria for engagement was completing an assignment, just the binary of is the assignment present or isn't would trigger the engagement part of attendance. In the same way, if you wanted to say, you know what, you could say a student needs to get at least a 50% to be complete, to be considered complete, then you would need an indicator somewhere to say 50% or above indicates presence. With the emotional well-being, I suppose it'd be like if a student participated, completed a survey, participated so in a social group in some way, shape, or form. I wouldn't say it's impossible to collect information in that way, but I think the thing that is probably easiest and applicable across most instances would be the behaviors that fall in the behavior category.
Yeah, maybe like including some socio-emotional questions in the exit tickets or something like some way of measuring that on a more regular basis. I think would be a good option there. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to talk through a couple different data sets here. We're going to talk through that the call log and the reading log. A lot of the kind of exports from learning management systems are kind of set already, and those are so unique. So we just wanted to talk about 2 of the things we've seen a lot of schools using since COVID-19 started. And we want to just kind of talk through some of our best practices for how to use those tools. So 2 quick items of framing here. You know, what we often see or saw a lot was that schools would set up these trackers and they'd be really detailed, and teachers would go in and they'd enter all this data, and then probably like a month or so later, board member, the principal, the grade level teams, they were suddenly had a question like, oh, well, how many of our students actually engaged, or how many of our students met this threshold? And that the trackers that people had put together were not actually set up well to answer analytic questions at kind of that administrative school level. And so we want to share with you some of like our tactics and our methods for how to collect that data in a way where you can answer these questions. And I think that leads me to my second point, which is this is not going to be a like super technical presentation on how to actually implement a lot of these formulas. Personally, when I learn technology, I kind of like to see the end goal, like what is the platform capable of, how could these formulas potentially work, and then understand like, okay, now I need to understand how to go use this formula because I like that. I want to implement that specific technique. So this is going to be very high level. We're going to walk you through some of our best practices. However, we're going to provide a link to some YouTube channel which is super helpful in terms of learning how to use a lot of different formulas in Google Sheets. Also, there was a great session this morning, which I think you can find the recording of, on how to implement a lot of these same exact formulas. So I think that there's a lot of resources for you out there. We just kind of wanted to talk you through like how we have helped schools solve some of these tracker problems and some of kind of the high level things you need to do to set up a system that will help you answer a lot of these questions down the road. We will put that up later. Okay, so in the session materials here, when you go into the Google Sheets examples, here is that folder here. We've got our Google Forms example, got our teacher entry examples. So those are actually the raw data that is coming in there. And then the student engagement data analysis, we're going to walk through. It has examples of how some of these formulas work to solve different problems when it comes to analyzing these two types of data. And these were, again, kind of where we saw a lot of issues or just a lot of things happening where the results were not as good as schools wanted it. So within teacher entry, we're going to start there. And how do you set up a communication log or a log that teachers are filling in on a semi-regular basis in an effective way? And I think one of the design challenges we've run into is like, how do you have teachers interact with their own Google Sheet or like enter data in a way that isn't a huge burden on them and then also it doesn't become a huge burden on you when you're trying to analyze this data later on. So we have found, and we'll go through this later, there's this function in Google Sheets called import range that essentially allows you to take a bunch of independent sheets and stack all the data together down the road. So this allows each teacher to kind of have their own entry sheet, keep track of their own data, and then later on you can bring it all together for analysis. But there's a couple things you need to do to get this set up appropriately. First, you're going to want to pre-fill a lot of the information to make it as easy as possible for teachers. So you want to be very clear about what they're supposed to enter and where, because as we'll see later, when we try to get all this data together, each sheet needs to be set up exactly the same. So that then allows you to make these combinations later and everything will line up. So you want to limit people's ability to customize these sheets. You don't want people adding columns. You don't want people, hiding rows. You don't want people doing those things. So you need to make it very clear, and simpler is better when you're setting these things up, but you want a few key pieces of information. So you want to be sure to make sure it's clear, like what needs to be entered and how. One of the techniques for that is data validation. So you can set up drop downs that have the values you want to enter. And that just limits the number of fields that people can enter things in that are not appropriate, because like we've seen, teachers kind of do their own thing, and some put in letters, some put in numbers, some put in colors, and then later on when you're trying to make sense of that or do an average or sum things up, you can't sum those things together. So making sure you know what values you want. But to that same point, you want to provide some kind of qualitative data entry in pretty much all of these opportunities, so people have something to put somewhere, so they can make notes on their students, they can make notes for follow-up, but you just want them to do it in the correct area rather than in a field that you need to use later on. And so then I think one of the other things we'll talk about in all of these is having a common identifier. So when you're setting up student entry, a lot of the times people go into their class roster and they just drop in the student names. And the problem is that student names are sometimes spelled differently in different systems. Sometimes there can be duplicate names. So really, the one thing you really want to be pulling in all the time is student number or student ID, so that you can do a match later on with the data. So it might seem a bit extraneous when you're setting up the form, but including it early on is super important. So that is some best practices for like how to set up this reading log. In this case, we have a real basic rating scale, just more illustrative than accurate. So I would not, this, I think you could build off of this a lot, but just, 1, lack of engagement, 4, hey, connected, student is being successful, all those things. So we'll see how we use that later on. Next, we want to talk about Google Forms. So how do you set up a Google form in a way that allows you to collect data in an effective way? So I think this is a sample form. We included it in the folder as well. Again, use drop downs as much as you can, because you cannot like necessarily rely on people to enter data correctly. And that's just any hand entered form of any level, much less students, or you're going to see a lot of different errors. So again, when we're trying to analyze this data later on, we want things to be accurate. So making sure you use drop downs can be helpful. You know, requiring certain fields is important. And then again, knowing what kind of data you actually want to be collecting. So in this case, you can set the form field. So let's say, you know, I read this book. Well, okay, so you can't enter that field and it's required. So this requires a number. So you want to do things like that where you can make sure that you're collecting the correct data. So let's go then to the actual output of the form. We have a few more things to talk about here. So that's the wrong tab. So first of all, you want to make sure you're collecting date and time with the forms. You know, this may not seem as important at the time, but later on, if you want to use some date filters, there's a lot of different date filters in Excel. So this can let you break things, responses down by week. If you want to measure changes over time, just put in the timestamp. You can kind of figure out how to use it later on, but that's super critical. So make sure the form is collecting that. I think the other thing with Google Forms that can be challenging when it comes to doing good analysis with them is that you need some kind of common identifier between the Google form and the other data sets you're using. And so again, back to that kind of manual entry question, you cannot really trust that students are going to be entering their names in a consistent manner. Like, it's not incorrect, but they might spell their last name differently. They might have different spacing, which may not seem like a big deal in the moment, but later on when you're trying to use a function or a formula that's trying to aggregate by a student, it's going to see each of those different entries as a different kid. And so the data is not going to make as much sense when you try to use these functions later on. So you really want to do a common identifier in the Google form. So Google Forms can automatically collect an email as long as the student is logged into their Gmail account. So if you're a Google school, each student has an account, they go into the form, you can get the Google form to automatically collect their email, which is a unique identifier that you can then use later on. Another thing we found is that having people enter their email as a part of the form submission may not seem like the most useful thing, but typically you enter your email consistently every time. And so that is better often than having kids enter their names or their IDs or something like that. And again, with Google Forms, you also want to include space for qualitative data because people will generally want to put that in there somewhere. So giving people the right form for that is super important. So that is a few of our techniques for collecting data. I think we're going to start in on some functions that you can use then to kind of combine and analyze this data. And again, you might be familiar with some of these functions, you might not, but the idea is just to kind of see how we have put them together in a very basic way to create some views. And if you like those, then you can kind of reverse engineer, you know, watch some YouTube videos, figure out how you want to learn the functions, learn from the other presenters as to like how you want to actually roll that out. And we will obviously be available for questions if you have specific questions about how to deploy any of these. So the first one we're going to talk about is the query function, which is right here. So one of the issues with collecting long data like this, so if you have people entering data multiple times, you're going to want to summarize this data by student or by week or by just any metric really. And so that is the query function in Google is really good at this. So it allows you to look at a range of data and basically summarize that data by you know, some type of aggregation. So if you're familiar with pivot tables, this is essentially the same thing, but it's much more flexible and gives you like cleaner, nicer looking tables that you can make as a part of a chart or a graph. You could do a lot more with it. So it's pretty useful as a way to do it. So in this example, we have written the query function that looks at our reading log, and it summarizes the number of total pages read by student. Pretty simple, but takes this kind of raw data form that we had previously and turns it into something we can then use. And the other nice thing is we included the email here in the output, so now we can go later on and merge this data with the other data we're collecting to create some kind of analysis that includes both reading log data and hand-entered teacher data. So going into the student engagement data analysis tab, that's a little spoiler alert there. We have this kind of overview tab here that looks at the functions we're going to be going over in each tab and kind of what their main purpose is. So this is just kind of a guide for you if you come back to this workbook and are curious as to what kind of methods we use. So we're going to start with import range, which is the function I talked a little bit about earlier. So import range is very good at bringing in values from multiple sheets or tabs within a sheet. So one of the other ways you could do the teacher entry is just have one Google Sheet workbook, but have a different tab for each teacher. And import range allows you to pull in data from there as well. So that is it's a pretty flexible method for doing that. Again, though, to bring it in, it's not smart. It just like pulls in the range of data you want from each tab. So that is why you need to make sure that each teacher's sheet is set up in the exact same way and uses the exact same numbers. Because now, like, let's say this list was 500 kids, for example, and we had one couple data errors in here. You know, you got to go through and clean out, make sure everything's a number, make sure there's no columns misaligned, things like that. So that's why I like setting these things up in a smart way is so important, because then you get nice, clean data coming out of it here. One kind of quirk with the Google sharing things, like they changed their sharing permissions a lot. So we've run into some issues with like things that used to work not working anymore because of sharing permissions. So you want to make sure you're providing access to each sheet or workbook. So you need to run like an import range on each sheet to make sure you have access to that sheet. But once you have like assigned this workbook here access to all of your sheets, you can use them you can like pull in data from them whenever you want. And so here are the links at the top of these pages. We've provided a link to each function, some like basic Google documentation. And then here's this Learn Google Spreadsheets YouTube channel. Can't recommend this enough. It's been super helpful for me. Great refreshers on here, even on like basic things. But, you know, has a lot of like advanced functions in here, different methods for doing things. So once you kind of know what you're trying to accomplish, it's really, there's a lot of super helpful examples in here. So really recommend this channel as a way to learn Google Sheets. So going back to our engagement analysis, now we're going to kind of walk through like how we set up this data set. One of the things that you'll want to be able to do is get an export from your student information system that has a lot of student characteristics. So provided usually questions about student performance, you want to break things down by subgroups. You know, you want to bring in information that might be living in your student information system so that you can get a little deeper analysis on your students. So one of the ways you can do that is you just do a quick export or whatever of all of your student information. What do you want to include in this quick export? The student number. All of the kind of unique identifiers you're using in the other data sheets, so that you have kind of one place to get to reference, so that you can get all the unique identifiers and merge data, which we'll show an example of in a second here of how we did that. So, you know, you need the email because that is your unique identifier for the Google form. And you need the student number because that is your unique identifier for the student entry. And then you have your SPED status and your L status, which is what we're interested in analyzing further. So that is kind of a key thing. You want to set this up to bring in all this data. Next, in order to get all the data together, there's a few different matching functions, which I think this is fairly common. VLOOKUP and index match are ways of bringing data like merging data sets together based off of a common identifier. So basically for this student number 1, we can go into other places and other data sets and find the SPED status. We can find the L status. We can find the email, and we can find the number of pages read from our reading log. So now we have this imported data set from the teacher log. We've imported the data from the reading log, and now we're able to get those to talk to each other. And so now we have this nice clean data set with all the students and their SPED and L information and their number of pages read from the reading log. So now we have like a pretty cool data set here that pulls in data from all these different forms. But again, it was kind of the setup and the thoughtfulness behind it that really let us get to this data set that we can now use to analyze, create dashboards, do all those things together. So I think we covered everything there. Again, you know, super helpful YouTube videos if you want to learn more about matching. You know, you can match on multiple columns. There's a lot of more advanced stuff you can do, but in this case, just a very simple, bring in all the data. So next, and I think this goes back to thinking about the questions that you're going to get asked about this data in advance. So what are you actually interested in with the reading log? Is it, did the student submit the reading log? So that's one question. Is it, how many total pages did they read? That's another possible question. So you want to like be able to anticipate and figure out like what are the kind of questions of interest when it comes to your data that you brought in. So in this example, for the 4 weeks of distance learning, our goal was that students would read 75 or more pages. Now, in order to answer that question, you know, we brought in the reading log. You know, you could do some kind of sort or filter or count or something like that based on that. What we like to do, especially when you're trying to do more advanced analytics later on, is just, it's a simple technique of creating a binary variable, 0 or 1, based off whether or not the student met this criteria or not. And this gives you a lot of flexibility because the sum of this column is the number of students who read 75 or more pages. You can average this column, so 56% of students read 75 or more pages. You can do all kinds of things with this 0 or 1, and then you can create all these binaries for what is interesting to you. So you can create one for, you know, if the student was a 1, or like the average of the total engagement was a certain score and they read more than 75 pages. So you kind of think through like what questions do we want to answer, and then you code these relevant variables onto this data set. So now we're just building up this awesome set to do some cool analysis with. We got all this nice clean data, we've got our variables of interest, and now we can use some different functions to create some sums or some averages and figure out some things on our students. So one of the first ways to do this, and we like to use this for like student watch lists, is the filter function. And I think the next like 2 functions we're going to talk about, filter and query, I think they're most useful because they're dynamic. So if we go in and change the data or add new data, these functions just go based off the range. So if you change the data in it, it will change the data farther down the line. So when you're going back to the data entering, like as teachers are entering new data, your data will change down the pipeline, like all the facts and figures. So that is super helpful for like creating some kind of dashboard ecosystem or some kind of metric tracker that kind of keeps you on top of things. But if you build the system, build the pipeline correctly, you're going to have like constantly updating data if you're using these rather than like pivot tables, which require you to go in and refresh everything. If you're, you know, kind of copying and pasting data together into an Excel sheet and then running pivot tables, like this allows you to kind of have this ecosystem that's consistently updating, which is super helpful. So the filter function, pretty basic, basically says, hey, give me what's in this range when these criteria are met. So in this case, we want a contact list for our front office when students are not, when we're not able to get a hold of the families. Teachers aren't able to get a hold of families. We want to flag that for the front office and have somebody from the school follow up. So we use the filter function that basically says, hey, go find me all the student information for when the engagement score for the week is a 1. So that is a just simple application of this filter function. And then, you can then get the students that are there in week 2. And that is like pretty good way of like developing watch lists, things like that. Next, we're going to talk about the query function again. So in addition to like summarizing data by student, like we saw at the end of the reading log, so we summed the total amount of pages read by student. You can also do like finer levels of aggregation. So if we wanted to aggregate by teacher or by grade level, the query function is also super flexible with that as well. So in this case, we said, hey, tell us what the percent, so we use that binary variable we created because we know when we average that, that column, it's gonna give us the average. So if we say, give me the average for each teacher, the query function is super good at answering questions like that. So in this case, 50% of the students here read 75 or more pages and 60% for teachers 2 and 3. So that can give you some kind of idea of, okay, are students engaging differently across classrooms? And then I think there's also a pivot functionality, which basically says, give us this by teacher and split it out for L status. If we're concerned about our L families and how they're engaging with the reading log, this is a good way of doing it. This like query function is super functional in the way you can like look at data for different demographic groups. So again, that's just super easy to write, looks at the data, consistently refresh and update it. Excellent way of doing that. So next we're just gonna have kind of an overview, super basic dashboard that kind of shows a little bit of the functionality of the query function. So this is like for each teacher, how many students were out of contact during distance learning. So this is like a pretty basic question that we get all the time after we've been entering all this data in the reading logs. It's like, well, how many kids are we not engaged with? And so this, because we did all that work in advance, we're now able to answer this question super easily. So this just uses the query function to figure out how many students have an engagement score of 1 during week 1, week 2, week 3, and week 4. And then what's awesome about the query function as well is that you can use these graphs, or like you can use the tables to create graphs. So the data will feed a graph, or it's much more difficult with a pivot table to do that. So you can create these things dynamically and they'll dynamically update, your graphs will change and shift. So when you're trying to build some kind of dashboard or visualization for the board, this is a super effective way to do that. And then down below, we just, again, are bringing in data by student. So now we want to know who are these kids that were disengaged? And then maybe how many pages did they read to understand like, well, maybe we just couldn't get a hold of them, but we wanted to know how many pages they read to see if they were engaging with the reading log instead. Maybe that's easier, or, they were able to do that, but maybe we just couldn't get a hold of them because it was a bad time. So these are, pretty basic ways of kind of combining data across these 2 data sources. I think we've laid the framework out for you where now you can get your export from your learning management system. And if you set it up with student IDs, you can bring that data in and merge the data onto our analysis data set again and create some kind of 3-pronged approach to engagement like we talked about before. Like, did they log on to the learning management system twice? Did they read 75 or more pages in the reading log? And were they engaged when the teacher called them? You can create that kind of binary variable and look at, okay, what percentage of students are engaged across classes? What percent of students are not engaged, or what percent of students meet a certain threshold? And like, how do we follow up with them in terms of contacting those families? So that's just kind of a high level overview of some of the techniques we've used to take this kind of messy data that's getting input and do it in a way that lets you get to a better place later on. I think that is all for now. Are there any questions in the chat at all? We are happy to take questions. I'm happy to walk through how to do any of the functions since we have a couple minutes, if people are interested in looking at how to write something. But otherwise, we've provided those resources for you to kind of follow up if you're interested in using some of these techniques.
Not seeing any questions in the chat right now, but there are some links to the session survey. So if you don't have a question and you are thinking of jumping off, please go ahead and grab the link to that survey so you can complete it.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining. See if any questions.
Dan, we did have one question come in. Okay. I think you'll be able to answer this one very well. Have you had any experience with functionality changing after the document has been created?
Like functionality of the Google Sheet, or like not really. I think the formulas are pretty stable, like how they do things. I think there are some different linkages. So if you were to go in and change the, like add a column somewhere and your column references were based on this. So we can just look at the query function here, pretty basic one. Basically says in our data set, select these columns. But let's say, in this set, we wanted to, add a column for some other student characteristic. We decided to put it right there. If you add that column, it's going to mess up your cell references. So I think generally the formulas are stable, so you're not going to like run into a situation where all of a sudden the kind of the syntax changed. But I think you can you kind of got to keep track of your data sets and make sure you're not kind of changing any of those parameters that the functions are using. Does that answer your question?
She's thinking follow up. I'm thinking more of needing to add in information to a teacher-facing document after it's been duplicated.
Yes. So let's say we have pulled out, so we've got our teacher logs, we've created one for each teacher. Now we want to add some kind of functionality to this. So there's kind of two ways to approach that. One is you can, you can think about adding things in later on in the process, so making these pretty simple, and then using that matching function to bring it on later. So one of the things we've seen is like making these teacher, like the data that gets pre-filled, too complicated, just makes it difficult to see, difficult to figure out what you want. So you could actually add on things like grade level and teacher name later on. I think another way to do it, which is a little more advanced, but I've done in the past, is you actually use this. You set up each teacher as an import range in itself. So for example, you have kind of your full student roster somewhere, or all the data you need. And then you can say, all right, give me the information that I want where teacher name equals this. And then that pulls in this into each individual tracker. And then when you make a change in the central place, it will then update all the different teacher trackers that you have created. But yeah, that's kind of that's definitely a challenge in terms of like all of a sudden wanting to add something and you've created all these different templates. There's not a great way around that.
I think that's something that we hear a lot, right? People realize, oh, well, actually it'd be really helpful if I had this, or, oh, there's one more week to this program, I need to capture information for that. It's one of the advantages of using something like an index match as opposed to a VLOOKUP. When Dan showed those two different lookup options, then index match, you can pull in the value based off of the column header. So even if you did need to add another column because it was necessary to include a characteristic in the tracker for your teacher, it wouldn't mess up your formulas, and you can keep the functionality that way. Okay, we've got a couple minutes left. If there's any more questions, feel free to add them to the chat, or before you leave us, make sure you fill out your survey. We are happy to sit here and answer more questions though. Or if you want to sit here with us and maybe you can hear the jazz musician that lives above me who has started practicing again, pretend that you live in an elevator like I do. You're more than welcome to sit here and do that with me for a couple more minutes.
We've all been being serenaded by Laura's neighbor for
Mm-hmm.
the entirety of the quarantine.
He's very talented.
He's very good. He's very good. He's
It's also very loud.
Yes, but it comes through. So, all right. Looks like
Okay.
logging off.
Fantastic. Well, we want to say thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. I also want to say a big thank you to the DC Charter School Alliance for hosting this event and creating so much wonderful collaboration and content over this week. At the end of our slide deck, there are a couple of other sessions or discussion topics that are related. So if you're interested in learning more about the things that we talked about today, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. Or check out any of the resources that are here. So thank you to go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I thought the intro to querying in Google Sheets was awesome. That what that was provides a much more detailed look at how you can implement this.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. And we hope you have a fantastic afternoon.